Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. Welcome to episode 1 of the Jeffrey Epstein case, an autopsy. You know, there's so much interest and intrigue surrounding the life and death of Jeffrey Epstein, and it's a story that involves some of today's most powerful, influential people, Attorney General Bill Barr, President Donald Trump, that I wanted to make a series of videos or episodes, if you will, kind of taking us through the publicly available evidence regarding what happened to Jeffrey Epstein. Is the evidence really more consistent with Jeffrey Epstein having killed himself in his jail cell, committed suicide, or is it really more consistent with Jeffrey Epstein having been murdered in his jail cell, homicide? After I'm done these videos, and what I'll do is I'll post them in a playlist. I think that's the right term. I'm not all that tech savvy, but I'll post them in a playlist on YouTube, and hopefully you can go through them in order. And then the final video in the series will be my closing argument, where I'll take all of the available evidence, everything we've discussed over the course of the series, and all the facts, all the circumstances, all of the inferences that we can draw from those facts and circumstances, and I'll make my best argument for what happened to Jeffrey Epstein and why. What I hope to bring to this series is an insider's perspective, somebody who was a career prosecutor, 30 years. I started out as an Army JAG, prosecuting court-martial cases in Alaska back in the 80s. And then after about six and a half years of active duty as an Army prosecutor, I joined the Department of Justice. Specifically, I became an assistant United States attorney at the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. At that office, I spent 22 of my 24 years handling murder cases, investigating, indicting, and trying murder cases. That was murder cases that were part of large RICO conspiracy gang prosecutions in federal district court, and murder cases that the U.S. Attorney's Office brought in the local criminal courts of the District of Columbia, Superior Court for the District of Columbia. So I handled more murder cases than I can count. I also investigated a number of suspicious deaths that looked like they may be a product of suicide. It turns out they were really homicides, and the killers had tried to cover up the crime by making it look like a suicide. I also investigated cases that were suspicious deaths that turned out to be suicides, but they had some really inexplicable facts and circumstances, even though at the end of the day, we were persuaded by the evidence that the appropriate ruling was a suicide. So I like to think I bring a wealth of experience to this endeavor, and I hope to give you all kind of an inside perspective into criminal investigations into homicides and suspected suicides. So let's start with the day of Jeffrey Epstein's death. Now, even though we're going to start with his death, there is a whole backstory that in future episodes we're going to have to tackle, because it is a strange, almost inexplicable backstory. And I'm not just talking about his horrific crimes in which he sexually trafficked young women, and did it for a number of very powerful, rich, influential people, but one of the really curious parts of his backstory is the way he got a non-prosecution agreement back in 2007 from then U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta down in Florida. And then, 12 years later, Jeffrey Epstein gets charged by federal authorities in New York for crimes that he had committed 12, 14, 15 years earlier. And we're going to talk in future episodes about what that might have been a product of. But I want to start today with the day Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell. August 10th, 2019. The way we all learned Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell was by a really unusual press release from the Department of Justice concerning a statement being issued by Attorney General Bill Barr. Let me read it to you. It's very short. So it's a Department of Justice Office of Public Affairs press release dated August 10th, 2019, and it reads as follows. Statement from Attorney General William P. Barr on the death of Jeffrey Epstein. Attorney General William P. Barr issues the following statement. I was appalled to learn that Jeffrey Epstein was found dead early this morning from an apparent suicide while in federal custody. Mr. Epstein's death raises serious questions that must be answered. In addition to the FBI's investigation, I have consulted with the Inspector General, who is opening an investigation into the circumstances of Mr. Epstein's death. Now, on August 10th, 2019, I was in London on vacation with my family. And I was notified, I don't remember exactly how, but I learned that this press release, this statement from Bill Barr had been put out concerning Jeffrey Epstein being found dead in his cell that very day, and that Bill Barr had apparently already announced the conclusion that it was a suicide. I got a call from MSNBC asking if I'd be willing, even though I was on vacation, to go on air in London and talk about the fact that this high-profile defendant, Jeffrey Epstein, had been found dead in his cell and that the Attorney General had put out this press release. So I said sure, and I went to the local studio in NBC studio in London. And here is what I said at the time after just having learned that Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell.
We'll go to your former federal prosecutor. How could this have happened?
You know, Candace, 22 of my 30 years as a prosecutor, I handled murder cases, and what I will say is that I don't think anybody should jump to conclusions. I've seen so many homicides that look like one thing and turn out to be something else. For example, if we find a dead body in a house fire, we assume it was an accident until we find that the person may have been manually strangled, murdered, before the house was set on fire to cover it up. I'm not suggesting this was anything other than a suicide, but I was a little bit surprised when I heard AG Barr jump right out there and make a snap decision saying this is an apparent suicide, and I'm appalled. I mean, that's ordinarily not how law enforcement acts. What we typically say is Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell. Pending an autopsy and a full investigation, we have no further comment at this time. So, you know, and some might say AG Barr has been prone to making quick pronouncements without having all the facts previously and hasn't always been accurate. So I don't think we can say definitively what this was, nor do I think we should speculate that it was nefarious and it was something that was made to look like a suicide. What we need to do is investigate. Importantly, we need the autopsy results to see, for example, if the hyoid bone was fractured, which is a telltale sign of manual strangulation, but not necessarily a hanging suicide. So, you know, I think there needs to be an investigation before the Attorney General starts to announce conclusions. So as you can see, I was skeptical of this announcement by Bill Barr. Before Jeffrey Epstein's body is even cooled, before any search of Jeffrey Epstein's jail cell for evidence of what actually happened, and before, most importantly, an autopsy had been performed to determine the cause and manner of Jeffrey Epstein's death, before all of that, Bill Barr runs to the Public Affairs Office of the Department of Justice and puts out a statement trying to convince America that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. First of all, folks, that's not the way we do it in the Department of Justice. In a high-profile case, first of all, the Department of Justice has rules against issuing any sorts of press releases under these circumstances. However, if the Department of Justice wanted to announce to the world what happened to Jeffrey Epstein, first of all, it should not have, and ordinarily would not have, come from the Attorney General himself. It would have been a press release issued by the Public Affairs Office. But even more importantly, the only thing that should have been said, and in ordinary times in a responsible Department of Justice, unlike Bill Barr's Department of Justice, the only thing that would have been said was, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell today at the Manhattan Correctional Center, a federal facility. We will have no further comment until the conclusion of a full and fair investigation, period. So it immediately caught my attention that Bill Barr is trying to convince America that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. But it then got so much more bizarre when the next day, which would have been August 12th, Bill Barr goes in front of the cameras at a speech to, I believe, an organization of the Fraternal Order of Police, and starts prattling on about the Jeffrey Epstein death. Let's take a look at what he said.
Before I begin, I'd like to briefly address news from the Manhattan Correctional Center over the weekend regarding Jeffrey Epstein. This sex trafficking case was very important to the Department of Justice and to me personally. It was important to the dedicated prosecutors in the Southern District of New York and to our FBI agents who investigated the case and were preparing it for trial. Most importantly, this case was important to the victims who had the courage to come forward and deserved the opportunity to confront the accused in the courtroom. I was appalled, and indeed the whole department was, and frankly, angry, to learn of the MCC's failure to adequately secure this prisoner. We are now learning of serious irregularities at this facility that are deeply concerning and demand a thorough investigation. The FBI and the Office of Inspector General are doing just that. We will get to the bottom of what happened, and there will be accountability. But let me assure you that this case will continue on against anyone who was complicit with Epstein. Any co-conspirators should not rest easy. The victims deserve justice, and they will get it.
Wait a minute. What is Bill Barr talking about when he says things like, this case was very important to me personally? Then he says that I was appalled and angry to learn of the MCC's failure to adequately secure its prisoner. Well, wait a minute, Bill Barr, you're in charge of the MCC. That is a Federal Bureau of Prisons facility, and the buck is supposed to stop with you. So Bill Barr is already pointing fingers at part of an organization that he is responsible for. And then he says, any co-conspirators should not rest easy. Well, guess what? Nobody else has ever been charged in connection with Jeffrey Epstein's crimes, as co-conspirators or otherwise. So all of this was beyond curious. Of course, as I mentioned in that clip with Candace Gibson, you can't say this was a suicide before an autopsy is performed, in part because you have to examine the interior of the neck for findings with respect to whether what happened might have been a suicide, might have been a manual strangulation homicide, might have been a ligature asphyxial homicide. And sure enough, we learned when the autopsy was performed and at least some of the results were shared with the public that there was a broken hyoid bone and fractured thyroid cartilage. Now, what does all that mean? Well, I got on the phone right after I heard those results with one of my trusted medical examiners, one of my forensic pathologists that I had dealt with for decades in Washington, D.C., somebody who had testified for me many times in murder cases, somebody who had performed thousands of autopsies. And I said, Doc, based on what I know from my couple of decades as a homicide prosecutor, a broken hyoid bone and fractured thyroid cartilage is far more consistent with a manual strangulation than with a hanging. And the medical examiner went through some of the literature with me and we talked about it. And she said, yes, the findings that she has seen reported are far more consistent with a manual strangulation, a homicide, as opposed to a hanging suicide. And here's where we're going to get down into the weeds of forensic pathology a little bit, because there are different kinds of hangings. In the forensic pathology community, medical examiners who perform autopsies sometimes use the term a judicial hanging. What does that mean? That refers back to the olden days, the Wild West, when somebody was sentenced to death and they were taken out into the public square, the gallows, and they were had a noose put around their neck, and then a sort of trap door under their feet would give way, and it would be a very high velocity type of hanging. And in those sorts of hangings, judicial hangings, you may see some fractured cartilage, you may see a broken hyoid bone, but in most hangings, in most suicides, that is not the case. You do not have findings like that, particularly in a jail cell, where a hanging is more of a low velocity hanging. Why? Because you don't have something high up on the ceiling and you're not able to hang yourself the way somebody could if they were not in a jail cell setting. It is a hanging where you might tie one end of a rope, and we're going to talk more about this in future episodes, what was found in Jeffrey Epstein's cell that frankly is not all that consistent with a suicide, but you would have to tie one end of a rope or a cord or some bed sheets torn into strips of fabric around part of a bunk bed, and then let gravity actually do the work, and you will die of asphyxiation by hanging yourself. But that is not a low velocity jail cell hanging, folks, is not going to produce a broken hyoid bone and fractured thyroid cartilage. So right there we have one big ticket piece of evidence that militates against suicide and in favor of homicide, murder. We're going to talk in more specifics about the autopsy results and some of the photographs of the interior of the jail cell, what the authorities found when they processed Jeffrey Epstein's jail cell for evidence. So we're going to get down into the weeds of the autopsy and the crime scene, or the suicide scene, excuse me. We haven't reached that determination yet, in the next episode. So in the meantime, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have feedback about what I am hoping will be an informative series about what happened to Jeffrey Epstein, I do hope you will post comments on YouTube or tweet your questions to me, and I'd like to make this a little bit more of a conversation and a give and take as we move through this series. So in the meantime, folks, I will always end with please stay safe, please stay coronavirus free, and I will let you all know when the next episode is ready to post of the Jeffrey Epstein case, An Autopsy.